Morning all. One of ChessCube's admins, Bryan, played Garry Kasparov, believe it or not, in a Simultaneous in his hometown Cape Town in South Africa. This Simul, which Kasparov played, was restricted, I think, by the ratings of the opponents. The normal Simul rules apply. Kasparov playing white, and Simuls can sometimes be really tough because as people get knocked out, there's still an onus for you to play your move when Kasparov comes round, the person doing the Simul comes round, and they might pause for as long as they want on your ball position. And there's actually a video showing just on one move, Kasparov spending several minutes actually on one move. So anyway, so Bryan playing black against Kasparov, which is a kind of an honour to play a living legend. Kasparov, one of the highest rated players of all time, one of the strongest ever players of all time. He kicked off with e4, and Bryan tried to play a hyper-modern opening, g6. I think this is actually called the modern defence. So after d4, bishop g7, or the pits, they can transpose into each other. Now Kasparov chose bishop e3, so a classical kind of setup, the two pawns side by side. Bishop e3 portrays an idea maybe to play queen d2, f3, and then maybe a hack attack later on the king side. Okay, now Bryan tried to interfere maybe with Kasparov's plans by playing c5, which at this point in time white cannot take, it seems, because of b2 being an issue, unless white wants to sacrifice the exchange. But no, Kasparov played actually here knight e2, so he supported that d4 pawn. Now Bryan doesn't really, I don't think he wants to take on d4, because this would be quite an annoying bishop here, and e5 would leave him with a gaping hole on d5. Okay, so he puts on more pressure on the d4 square. It seems quite logical to do this. Knight c6, and here again b2 is an issue if either d5 or d takes. Kasparov plays knight bc3, and now it might be becoming a problem if this pawn moves or if it takes on c5 here, because this diagonal has now been shielded more. Perhaps the first controversial move by Bryan, queen a5. So there's a sort of novel opening choice, and maybe a key point about this is if d5, then perhaps knight e5 could be a real nuisance, trying to play, say, knight c4 as well as knight g4. So unfortunately, I think Kasparov played a seemingly anti-positional move, but it is supported by this bishop on e3. He played d takes c5. In a lot of variations, taking on c5 would kind of ruin one's central control sometimes if the pawn can be recaptured, but here it's tricky. And also, unfortunately, Bryan, c3 is protected by the knight on e2. There's no issue with the c3 knight either, so it looks as though black is in trouble here. Bryan plays knight f6, now threatening knight takes e4. And instead of a move like knight g3, perhaps even stronger, simply to support e4 with f3, leaving the bishop on f1 a little bit longer, and maybe the knight doesn't have to go to g3, it can go somewhere else like knight f4. So black castles, and now one of the true horrors about this pawn is if it can be fully reinforced, it can actually contribute a lot to white's central control. And this next move, a3, aims to reinforce this c5 pawn. So the queen is also going to get evicted. So black's pieces are starting to be driven back here. Bryan plays now a6. In the comments for the game, there is the comment, black's pieces cannot move. For example, the c8 bishop, that's hemmed in. Yes, that's hemmed in by the pawn. So d6 is hard to achieve, b6 is hard to achieve. This pawn is not only contributing to white's central control, black's development has been heavily restricted here. This is the problem piece of black's position here. So a6, this is not a good sign that the Simul's going that well. b4, reinforcing the pawn, kicking the queen back. So Bryan really has to generate some counterplay here. How will he do it? I think he might have to sacrifice a pawn, it seems, with d6, or try and make use of the dark squares somehow. Rook b1, as though now also b5 might be useful, but the rook's getting away from that diagonal as well. Rook d8, as though d6 trying to liberate black's position a little bit. But unfortunately now comes knight d5. Kasparov is not routinely developing his pieces, he's extending his central control really. After knight takes d5, e takes, this massive pawns, this control of key central squares, it seems white's winning the central square battle. Knight e5, now knight g3, and it looks as though this knight might be a tempo gainer for an f4, f5, which might also undermine black's king side. This f5 break, imagine if white castles and has a rook on f1, this is going to be quite sensitive. d6, and of course the pawn's reinforced already, but at least the bishop is given some scope here. Bishop e2, and now it looks as though f4 is immediately on the cards after bishop e2, controlling g4 if f4 is played. So h5 gives the knight a hook, but it is weakening a bit the king side. King side's even more fragile now. You can imagine a later f4, f5 is going to leave the king side even more damaged. After white castles, there's pent up energy here, and this h4 can be easily answered with knight e4, or even a more esoteric maneuver if needed, but knight e4 seems sufficient as well. But the main point was just to provide a hook, I believe, for the g4 square if f4. Bishop d7, and now this moves c4, which reinforces d5 just in case. d5 pawn is reinforced, the queen is now freer to sort of maybe exchange off the dark square bishops without d5 being an issue in certain variations. Black really hasn't got much of a plan here, it looks pretty grim, but any move to try and get counterplay could cause a problem maybe if Kasparov slips up, being a Simul. But as I say, from the videos of this Simul, Kasparov was pretty attentive and was stopping for quite some time at various points. Rook e8, and now we see, okay, black's waiting a bit, queen d2, as though the dark square bishop exchange is on the cards, followed by the f4 tempo gain is going to be useful in f5 later on. Or these plans can be interchanged. a5, trying to get maybe some a-file counterplay, and now comes f4. Okay, so things have started to take a forcing turn after knight g4. White takes on g4, bishop takes g4, and now f5, liberating the bishop, preparing bishop h6, forming another dent in black's king side here. Black took on b4, and now we see fg, and black's king side is being weakened and weakened here. Now Kasparov takes on b4, rook f8, and this dark square bishop is kind of one of the guardians of black's king here, and Kasparov plays bishop d4, so if he can soften up the king a little bit more, it's going to be even worse. Here a desperate measure is used, but it looks like it's real trouble, this position for black now. Look at the g5 square, for example. Bishop takes, queen d4, knight e4. It looks very unpleasant for knight g5. If the knight comes to e6, that would spell end of the game. So e5 is the desperate measure black uses. So losing another pawn temporarily. Okay, so d takes e6. And now we see d takes c5. Okay, at least the queen is protecting g7. So after bishop takes g7, queen takes g7. But this pawn looks a bit of a menace. Kasparov takes actually on f8. After rook takes f8. Now plays rook e1. This pawn is quite dangerous now for moving forward, and actually black blockades it with Queen E7. And here we see the weakness of the last move. It's not protecting H6. Kasparov pounces on that with Queen H6. And here Bryan's under severe pressure to defend G6 adequately. His king side, which was previously weak, is now just falling apart. He plays Rook F6, and now we see H3 kicking that bishop, and it really hasn't got many squares apart from bishop F5. On bishop F5, interestingly, I think there's an interesting variation, without checking this with an engine. Knight takes. Now if rook takes, then queen takes G6, but I wonder if G takes, actually, if white can afford to do this, queen takes F6 to unblockade the pawn, and E7. That might be getting material, the queen back, being a rook up as well. There's a token check, but after that, you know, that wouldn't be much. So this looks pretty dire straits here after this simple move H3. Okay, in this position Bryan played H4, and the knight just attacks the rook, so black is losing material. And here actually Bryan resigns. If rook takes E6, seemingly countering the attack on the bishop against E4, Kasparov can simply take here, and if rook takes E4, then queen takes G6, double attacking the king and E4, being a rook up there. Let's just quickly technically check this other variation I've just mentioned, just to make sure it's not fictional. After this H3 move, so let's plug this into the engine here. If knight F5, rather bishop F5, it seems knight takes F5, now G takes, yes, queen takes F6 would be an absolute cruncher here, as I've just pointed out. So let's go back and review the game. Okay, Kasparov did play exceptionally well for a simultaneous display, but in Bryan's defense, Kasparov, took several minutes on key moments during the game. This was perhaps an unexpected capture now, this D takes C5, but it's actually finally logically justified with C3 being shielded. The pawn is actually strategically important for cutting out the natural development of this C8 bishop. Knight F6, F3, not making use of knight G3, it's keeping guard of the C3 knight, just in case. Castle's now A3, just kicking the queen away soon. A6, so already this is unpleasant for black. Rook B1, getting away from any trouble on the diagonal. Rook D8, now knight D5, increasing white's central control, because it's actually driving the knight to a less than ideal square E5, where it can be subject to further tempo gain. So white's central control is improving and improving. The knight is also quite good on this G3 if after the tempo gain it supports F5. So after D6, bishop E2, as though F4 is a serious threat to drive the knight back. It's downhill here after H5. It seems black's king side is being softened up with many of white's moves here. So C4, rook E8, queen D2, revealing wanting maybe bishop H6. But the other way to get the bishop, as demonstrated, is also after the temporary blockage of the bishop, to use the D4 square potentially. But F5 liberates the bishop for bishop H6 being an option, as well as bishop D4 soon. A takes, now FG, so also note the queen is a bit away from the king here, this pawn in the way. So black's king looks a little bit helpless. So a resourceful try though by Bryan, this temporary pawn sack, or rather it turned out to be there for quite some time. Now here it does look grim if bishop takes e6. Let's actually just touch on bishop takes e6. That might actually be one of black's best moves here. Or rook takes and then d takes. If bishop takes e6, actually that's not really rated. Rook takes f8. If rook takes f8, bishop takes, well, c takes d6, and then this d pawn could have been a problem according to engines here. So yes, this d pawn could be a problem. So really it's a choice of, it's one of those situations of choosing lesser evils. So after d takes e6, d takes c5. Okay, so bishop takes g7, weakening black's king potentially, but this pawn is now a distracting menace after rook e1, and it causes this kind of weakness of the last move. The queen is no longer guarding h6, and after the invasion with queen h6 and rook f6 is the final major blunder. Perhaps queen g7 is to be considered here, and to carry on the fight. Actually, I've been painting a pretty bleak picture of this position, but if you look at it, even here at move 28, technically, the engine doesn't really give white as a major advantage. It seems actually, in this position, queen f6 might be a very resourceful try. So what's going on here after queen f6? Less than the half a pawn advantage. Congratulations, Bryan. It wasn't a whitewash. After move 28, if you had played queen f6, according to Houdini, less than half a pawn advantage. What has happened here? If e7, say, this would be a mate in free check and losing the rook. Rook's loose. So if Kasparov will be forced to retract his move, queen h6, then c takes b4, and this pawn could be dangerous. Okay, e7 and white's advantage, okay, might be half a pawn here, and it might be good enough for Kasparov to win, but still, that is a major achievement. I honestly thought the evaluation was worse than what it was. So actually, e5 was actually one of the stronger moves. It was also a move there. D takes c5. Okay, is mentioned as well. So Bryan has played this very resourcefully actually to get this position to be able to recapture with his queen. And it seems, yeah, maybe this is too much of a celebration of the weakness of the last move. If queen f6 is a very useful resource. Yeah, queen f6. Okay. So this game, you know, did show Bryan being very resourceful. Nothing to be ashamed of. It wasn't just a clean kill. That's a bit of a turn up for the books, because I thought earlier it looked kind of menacing. Let's go back a third time and have a look at the evaluation shifts of this game to see what was this? Was white ever like a pawn up, clear pawn up? Okay, I know he was technically a pawn up. So we have here an evaluation about equal so far. D takes c5. Okay, it becomes one of the moves. Yes, but there is perhaps dynamic compensation here. Actually, the immediate b6 might have reaped some more of the dynamic compensation here. It would have released the bishop, and black has some play for the pawn, which is good in Simul. You're supposed to generate as much counterplay and activity as possible to provide complexity to the person giving the Simul. So maybe, okay, that's an alternative continuation there. Let's go back after f3. okay, we had castles, the evaluation about half pawn, but it's starting to creep up. I think b4, it starts to creep up over a pawn here for a while. But then actually rook b1, we have as though black is doing better after rook b1 than white playing queen d2. So this idea of rook d8 and d6 is actually quite good, I think. So after knight d5, it actually goes to almost equality here, believe it or not. So is this kind of an inaccurate move? Actually, in Bryan notes, to be fair, he did say equals, and I wasn't really paying attention too much to those, but no, it seems to be about equal around here. Black has some compensation, but how does he actually solve this c8 bishop? So d6, maybe the bishop isn't such a problem. I think the problems actually started with the self-weakening of the king side with h5. So if we try and play the engine recommendation here, d takes c5, at least it doesn't touch the king side's safety. So check, and this might be troublesome. Let's say bishop d2, for example, there's queen takes c5, and if king f2, then that's not ideal. Maybe pawn grabbing might be justified, queen takes a3, and it looks about equal. So this is very interesting, that this d6 plan is actually quite good, it seems. There's no way white would want to take with the bishop, surely. Bishop takes the d5, pawn is exposed, b6, and then bishop b7, d5 is a pain here. Black would actually be seizing the advantage. So wow. So I think h5, the evaluation did shift in white's favour after h5, so don't weaken your king against Kasparov if you're in a Simul against him by playing a move like h5. I think just try and generate, pressure, counterplay without weakening your king. So after castles, bishop d7, we saw the evaluation, nearly a pawn advantage for white, but never quite. It's just okay. Here it seems to be getting a bit worse after, instead of h4, maybe that's the best to play h3. That's another counterplay plan, just to undermine white's structure a little bit. And bishop f5, and again we're about half a pawn here. Unbelievable. So the h5 pawn could even show its teeth a little bit here to try and undermine white's king. Chess is not so clear cut as we see from this third pass through the game. So knight g4. Okay, black's king was getting a little bit weakened, but f5 it seems carries a little bit of controversy. h4. Okay, no, maybe not. This does look as though now finally white's getting almost a pawn advantage technically. So after e5 though, takes, that is one of the, is that one of the better moves? Or maybe, okay, there's other alternatives here. First taking on f1, then d takes. Again, it seems here that even in this position it looks as though it's really dangerous, but what is going on here to give black counterplay? Bishop takes g7, say, queen takes g7, and black has some counterplay, or not. Queen d5 doesn't look too good. Okay, that pawn is a menace here. Let's turn that off. Hang on. So bishop takes g7. Yes, this isn't good now. Bishop takes g7, queen takes. So here, okay, it looks quite bleak, but should it be? Okay, white is technically a pawn up, and the e6 pawn's really dangerous. So queen e7 was actually an ingenious decoy to decoy white to have a weakness of the last move. The queen was actually protecting f2 securely. So maybe this is a little bit over ambitious. It was trying to exploit this queen moving away from h6, but f2, this move, queen f6, wow, queen f6. Bryan has to be congratulated. Move 28 against one of the strongest players ever in chess history. At leisure, taking sometimes several minutes on a particular move. So at move 28, after queen f6, technically here, depth 18, advantage 0.33. Wow. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Okay, so unfortunately rook f6. Yeah, knight, sorry, h3, yes, white's advantage now is definitely big after h4 especially. Taking on e6, it looks pretty desperate to sacrifice a bishop. It's looks pretty bleak now. So here in this variation, this would be like a losing rook, and in the game continuation, Bryan resigns here. Okay, one more thing, bishop f5. It would just be losing the exchange, yeah. Okay, it isn't so clear cut sometimes, is it, in chess? You need to do a thorough check, and Kasparov would recommend that, a thorough check to see improvements, and even from games you win. So congratulations, Bryan, great experience playing one of the strongest players ever, and to your credit, in many of the variations you almost, you know, achieved near equality even after 28 moves. Well done. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.